everybody. Welcome. My name is Margil. I work with an organization that's actually based here in Spokane called the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights. And if you're wondering if you're in the right place, tonight we're going to be talking about the rights of nature. Anyone in the wrong place? So I thought what I would do tonight is give a bit of the basics, if you will, of the rights of nature, what it is, why it is going forward, how it's moving forward. And I also wanted to leave some time, though, for us to have a conversation if we want, questions, that kind of thing. So I'll talk for a little bit. I know we're supposed to wrap up at 7, so I want to be respectful of folks' time. And I know some folks are going to sneak out to go to choir. So hopefully you'll get some and be able to watch this. City Channel 5 is taping tonight, which is really nice. And so we're going to be able to get it out on social media. Folks can watch it. Please share with your friends, like all that. But I'll just start by saying my organization is a nonprofit organization. We focus on advancing democratic rights and environmental rights. And when I say environmental rights, what I mean are both the human right to a healthy environment and the rights of the environment itself. So the rights, what we call the rights of nature, for nature to have its own legal rights. And we'll get into what that means. So I founded the organization about 5 years ago with my colleague Thomas Lindsay. Thomas wrote the very first rights of nature law in the world back in 2006. And what a rights of nature means is it's just like it sounds, which is the recognition of legal rights of nature. Nature could be all of nature, such as now is recognized within the country of Ecuador. All of nature has its rights recognized within the Constitution there. Could be a particular ecosystem, like a river. Just in the last few days in Peru, the first river there was recognized as possessing legal rights by a court. Or it could be a species. We've worked with the White Earth Band of Chippewa, Ojibwe, in Minnesota to recognize the rights of the first species, a plant species, wild rice, or what they would call monomen. And what we mean by recognizing rights of nature is it could be nature, ecosystem, species, and the rights that we're working to recognize through law, through a court judgment, begin with the most basic right of all, which is the right to exist, the right to be. Beyond that, you have rights to thrive or to flourish, rights to regenerate. So if an ecosystem, for example, undergoes some sort of harm, it's able to regenerate, it's able to recuperate, and that also includes a right to restoration. We have other rights that are being recognized for nature, such as the right to perform its natural functions. So if we think about a river, for instance, a river is not only just water flowing downstream, it's providing habitat, it's providing sustenance for the other creatures that depend upon it. It's filtering water. It's doing all sorts of things as an ecosystem that we may not see, but it's carrying all of these historic natural functions. So the right to perform its natural functions for a river would mean that it's a healthy river system that's doing what it should naturally do. So those are some of the rights that have been recognized. Rights, as this work has evolved, and this work is evolving naturally, I would like to think, much like nature evolves, the right to evolve has been recognized now for nature in places like Ecuador, which again means that if nature is evolving naturally, it means that it's behaving naturally, that it's able to exist naturally as nature. Other rights now that we're seeing beyond those sort of basic core rights of a right to exist, a right to thrive, a right to regenerate, to be restored, to perform its natural functions, getting more precise with specific ecosystems or specific species. So for instance, in Ecuador, courts there have recognized that migratory species have a right to migrate. Think of birds, for instance, or fish that migrate. So that means they need to have a right to a migratory corridor. The habitat that they need to be a healthy, self-sustaining population means they need to have habitat along their migratory corridor. We've seen other rights recognized in places like Lafayette, Colorado, where we worked on a law where they were concerned about fracking coming into the community. This is right close to Boulder, when there's tons of fracking in Colorado, as you may know. And there they were very worried about fracking coming in, so they recognized not only the rights of nature and a specific right to a healthy, stable climate, but knowing that fracking, which is a major fossil fuel extraction and production industry, would violate that right. So they prohibited fracking as a violation of that right to a healthy climate. We've seen other rights recognized, such as a right to clean air, clean water. And as laws are becoming sort of more, evolving more, becoming more precisely focused on particular ecosystems or particular species, you're seeing more particular rights that are necessary for that species or that ecosystem to be healthy, to thrive, et cetera. So that's what the rights of nature is. Recognizing legal rights could be through local laws, could be state laws, could be national laws, national constitutions, state level constitutions. It could be through court judgments, courts recognizing or finding that a river or another ecosystem, for instance, has certain legal rights. And so that's generally how lawmaking occurs, through direct lawmaking. It could be through citizen initiative, like we have here in the city of Spokane, and efforts on the rights of nature move forward here as well. So this is moving forward, and it also is moving forward not only in that way, but also in tribal nations. First Nations are moving this forward. Both in Canada and in the United States have moved it into their tribal law and governance. So we're seeing it move at all different levels, through all different levels of government, different cultures, different geographies, different continents. So it's a growing movement. So what I'd like to do is just sort of tell you how it's evolved and why it's evolving. So as I mentioned, my colleague Thomas wrote the first rights of nature law anywhere in the world, and that was for a place called Tamaqua Borough in the state of Pennsylvania, a small place that was facing threats to the environment because the state was licensing for toxic waste essentially to be dumped into the community. And the community recognized that that would be quite harmful, not only to the natural environment, but to themselves, the public health. And so they looked out into the world to find out what could help them. And this is a process that communities go through constantly. What I mean by that is communities across the United States, across Australia, across Europe, in Latin America, all over, people are facing threats. And by that I mean things like toxic waste being dumped in your community, sewage sludge being dumped on farmland, fracking, as I mentioned, that's happening in Colorado and all over the world. You have mining, you have pipelines, you have factory farms, you have companies coming in to siphon off your water to bottle and sell somewhere else. You have a whole host of what I would call industrial activities that are licensed by the state or federal government to come in and conduct its operations within your community. And communities that are facing this, and really everywhere this is happening, they're recognizing that there are harms to public health, there's harms to the local environment, they're worried about their drinking water, could be any number of concerns that causes people in a community to go, hold on, this doesn't sound good. We want to do something to try to stop this from coming in. That is a process that's going on every day, everywhere, all over the world. And what communities find, and what Tamaqua Borough found in Pennsylvania, was that when they looked to their state government, in Pennsylvania's Department of Environmental Protection, the DEP, they found that the state was actually issuing permits to corporations to conduct the activity that was going to bring harm into the community. And other communities within Pennsylvania found that the state was issuing permits to oil and gas corporations to conduct fracking or to build pipelines or dumping of frack waste in retired wells. Factory farms were being given permits by the state government to set up operations within communities in Pennsylvania. And I'm only focusing on Pennsylvania, not to single it out as terrible, but because it's just representative of everywhere else and where this work first got its start. And so this was happening in communities all over. And what communities find is they go through a process, it's a learning process that we all have to go through when we're facing something like this. And suddenly we're like, what do we do? Naturally, you look to your state legislators for help, for instance. You look to your state environmental agencies for help. And what people found in Tamaqua, as people find all over, is that not only was the state not there to help them solve the problem by helping them to protect the environment within their community or the public health within their community, but the state was actually the ones giving authority to a company to come in and conduct the very harm that the community wanted to stop. And that's a bit of a trick of the mind there to figure that one out, because communities think that the state government is there to protect them, but they find that, in fact, what the government is in the business of doing is literally issuing permission or permits to corporations to come in and conduct certain industrial activities. And when communities run into this, they're running into something of a brick wall. Because when they go to the state government for help, they find that help isn't there. They go to the federal government, same thing. Federal government under our Clean Air Act, our Clean Water Act, all the environmental laws that we find at our state and our federal level are largely in the business of regulating how we use nature. I'll say that again, regulating our use of nature, our exploitation of nature, our extraction of nature. That's what environmental laws generally do. They're regulating how we human beings, largely in the form of corporations, can go about using our air, our water, our soils. So for instance, when you think about fracking, for instance, which is all over, fracking corporations, they receive permits to use millions of gallons of fresh, clean water at every frack well to shoot miles underground, cause explosions, and contaminate millions of gallons of fresh water at every frack well. And we don't have a good way to clean that up. So they're being given permission to contaminate, to harm fresh water. Same thing when you think about companies that are given permission to pollute the atmosphere, to send carbon emissions up into the atmosphere and accelerate climate change. They're being given the legal authority to do that by government. And so when we think about what environmental laws actually do and what communities like Tomahawk run into is these environmental laws are not environmental protection laws, even though we think of them as environmental protection laws. They're actually about environmental use, using the natural world. And when we start to get our minds around this idea that our environmental laws are about regulating how we can use nature, it starts to begin to make sense to us that, oh, okay, so if we're giving permission to use nature, that means we're giving permission to harm nature, to destroy nature. And so you have, for instance, developers being given permission to just fill wetlands, to build a strip mall, for instance. We were involved in a case in Florida in which that was happening. And fill doesn't sound so bad. But what fill means is actually to destroy a wetland in order to put up, I don't know, McDonald's or something. Not to pick on McDonald's. But that's what these are doing. That's what these laws are doing. In West Virginia, Federal Clean Water Act, corporations are getting permits to blow the tops off of mountains, which destroys the mountain ecosystem. I'm laughing because otherwise I'd probably start crying. That's what our environmental laws are doing. They're allowing us to use the natural world as fast as possible and putting it under the veneer of legitimacy by having it legalized under law. And so the question is, A, how do we get here? And then what do we do about it? So how do we get here? Well, corporations write and industries write largely the laws that are regulating their own industries, right? They're considered the experts. And so they're writing laws, state and level law, federal laws, that legalize the activities they want to be able to carry out. And so activists try to influence those laws, and really all they're doing is trying to work around the edges, making fracking perhaps a little less bad, whatever that means. We've had cases in Pennsylvania where this work began in which there is an agreement not to dump sewage sludge, toxic sewage sludge on farmland, which is being given away free to farmers to use as fertilizer, that they weren't going to dump it on Sundays. Okay, terrific. That doesn't mean that you're not doing the activity, you're just putting sort of limitations, like we're not going to do it past 9 o'clock at night. Great. That doesn't stop the activity. It only puts certain conditions on it going forward. And so when we begin to understand how our environmental laws work in places like Tamaqua that are just, you can throw up your hands and say, well, if that's how the system works, there's nothing for us to do. And unfortunately, many communities run into that brick wall, bounce off it, and find themselves without a remedy. But some people are unwilling to accept things as they are. And those are the people who are the real change makers, in my experience. And the people of Tumaco are among them. And they said, we're unwilling to accept this as it is. How can this be? And so they decided that they would take themselves out from under what we would call, the environmental legal system, all these environmental laws that were not set up to help them. And so they decided that those laws weren't going to protect them. They needed to create something new. And so they took themselves out from under that and decided that they were going to create a new kind of law, a rights of nature law. And so they became the first in the world to adopt a law that recognizes that nature has certain rights to exist, rights to thrive, and prohibited the dumping of that toxic waste into the community. Other communities have since followed. We now have 36 plus across 10 states in the United States that have adopted rights of nature laws. And these laws are, recognize rights of nature and generally prohibit certain activities that would violate those rights. I mentioned Lafayette, Colorado, who banned fracking. Many communities have now banned fracking as a violation of the rights of nature, thinking that if you're fracking in a community, which not only contaminates millions of gallons of water at every frack well, but also causes methane release, which is a huge climate change accelerator, and other pollution and other harm. So communities have said fracking is incompatible with protection of nature and would be a direct violation of the rights of nature. You've had communities do this to stop commercial water bottling activities, factory farms, and other activities. And what this is doing is these laws are not only saying, hey, isn't it great that nature possesses legal rights? They're transforming how nature itself is treated under the law. And what I mean by that is, I mentioned that environmental laws regulate how we use nature. Why are they able to do that? Well, they're able to do that because nature is itself treated as an it. It's treated as a thing, or what we often say, it's treated as property or an item of commerce. Meaning that nature is just sitting there as this thing, and our laws treat it as sort of waiting around for us to come along and use it, or extract it, or pollute it. And it means that when we think about nature, we're not thinking about a living entity with legal rights, like even that basic right to exist. Rather, what we're thinking about is this thing that we're going to figure out how we can buy, sell, trade, extract, etc. We've done this before in the law. This is not a new idea. We did this before with enslaved people. We did this before with women. We've done it with indigenous peoples who were treated as essentially non-existing as living beings with protection and other rights, but rather as just sort of things that we being those in power, are able to use. And so, there were movements in this country and other countries, of course, that historically have pushed against those legal systems that enslaved human beings, for instance. And the way those abolitionists decided to move forward to end slavery was they refused to accept the system as it was. They came up against a legal system that codified that human beings could be slaves, and that there were slave codes that regulated how they could be used, whether they could be taught, to read, for instance, where they could travel or not travel, that they had to wear some kind of identification on themselves all the time. So we were regulating this property of the slave holders. The abolitionist movement looked at the existing system of law, which codified slavery, which meant that human beings were treated as property or its or things that could be owned, traded, exploited, destroyed, killed by others, and said we refuse to accept that. And they went through a process, of course, over generations, really, to transform how the system of law treated these human beings that were enslaved. And they moved them, transformed them from being treated as property to becoming recognized as living human beings with certain legal rights and protections. And that's a really fundamental shift in law and governance. It changes the purpose of law and governance for those human beings. That was a movement that transformed them, much like women, too, were treated as the property of their husband or of their father, for instance. There were, just like there were slave codes regulating how slaves could be used, there were codes, coverture laws, that regulated essentially how women could be used. that determined that anything a woman owned was that of her husband's. That, for instance, rape was considered to be a property crime. Because if a woman was property, then rape would harm her, causing damage to that property, and then a monetary damage would be paid to her owner, her father, or her husband, for instance. The women's rights movement, we often think about it as focusing on the right of women to vote, obviously important, but it was also about transforming how women were treated under the law, to actually being recognized under the law as living human beings with legal rights to protection, rights to vote, right to divorce, right to retain their own property. Those movements, the women's rights movement, the abolitionist movement, and other movements have recognized that if the legal system itself is not recognizing something, is keeping it out of the sphere of protection or the sphere of rights, you have to transform that system. You can't work around the edges to try to make slavery better or how women were treated better. You actually had to transform how they were treated under the law itself and move them into that sphere of protection to have them recognized as rights-bearing. Nature largely sits over here today in most of the world. Nature is this it. We have environmental laws which treat it, as I mentioned, as property, as an it, as a thing. And now we're facing enormous environmental crises. I am confident that nobody is in this room because they don't care about the environment. That we're facing climate change, when I first moved here, we didn't have wildfire season. Now we do, and we predict it, like we predict, how snowy the winter will be. That's so insane that if you told me, and I didn't live here, I'd think that's crazy. But that's what we have. We have species extinction that's accelerating far faster than natural background rates. Biodiversity crises, we have ecosystems that are collapsing. If I read one more thing about how hot the oceans are and how hot the past decade will be, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get out of bed. So we're in a time of great environmental crises, and more people in more and more places all over the world are refusing to accept the existing system as is. That is our experience. They're looking at their environmental legal systems and they're saying, this isn't working. It's not enough for us to try to make mining better or fracking better, or whatever it is better. This thing that's causing this huge environmental harm. We need to transform the system of law itself. That means a fundamental shift in humankind's relationship with the natural world and moving that actually into law so that we're no longer treating nature as this thing, this it, this property, that we are just sitting around using up as fast as possible. We actually need to transform nature to being recognized as a rights-bearing entity with a right to protection, a right to actually be, and change how we relate to nature, not only in our individual practices and day-to-day lives, but within our law and governance, so that the decisions that we are making, we the people within our laws, that we're no longer making decisions that are actually harming the ability of nature to even exist. That we are changing the criteria by which we make decisions, how we live on the planet. That's a huge fundamental shift in what law and governance is about, from our laws being about how do we use nature as fast as possible to how do we protect nature. Many call it a move from sort of an anthropocentric perspective, a human perspective on the natural world, to one in which we recognize an ecocentric perspective. That is, that we recognize that we're not superior to nature and nature's subordinate, as Colombia's constitutional court has explained, that we recognize that we are part of nature and that we have a responsibility to nature and that we need to be stewards of nature. And so this sort of is as much a cultural shift as it is a legal shift, in which we have to change our mindset, much like in these past movements, women's movement, abolitionist movements, other movements. We had to change how we literally saw the thing that was being oppressed, and then recognize that we have to move that change into binding law. So today, as I mentioned, the first places to recognize rights of nature were communities in the United States facing threats to the environment and said, the existing system isn't going to protect us. We need to create a new system. And so this work is continuing to grow in the United States. In 2000, now, first law was in 2006 and 2008. We were invited to Ecuador. They were drafting a new constitution. And we met with delegates to their constitutional convention. And Ecuador is a place of amazing, unique ecosystems, the Andes, the Amazon, the Galapagos, as well as unique and incredibly biodiversity hotspots with unique species, all under threat from mining and other kinds of activities that multinational corporations are conducting across the country. And through a process there, Ecuador drafted their new constitution. We helped consult on that drafting process and became the first country in the world to recognize that nature possesses constitutional rights, what they call fundamental rights. And that was in 2008, and it was passed overwhelmingly by the people of Ecuador. Since Ecuador did this constitutional change, it kind of opened the eyes, I think, of people all over the world. We started getting calls from Nepal and India and Australia and other countries where people were facing all sorts of environmental harm and threats and said, we need to do something differently. So today, it's 15 plus years on. You have, as I mentioned, tribal and First Nations, Canada, the United States that have adopted the rights of nature into their governing frameworks. You have Ecuador, Bolivia, Panama, Uganda that have passed national rights of nature laws. You have countries like Spain that has recognized the rights of the Mar Menor Lagoon, so a national law to recognize the rights of a particular ecosystem. That's happened in New Zealand as well. You have courts in countries that don't have rights of nature laws, but courts are essentially looking beyond their own jurisdiction to say, what's happening within the environmental legal world? We're all facing crises. Our current existing environmental laws are not doing the job. What else can we bring in? And so you've had countries like in Colombia, the Constitutional Court has recognized the rights of the Atrato River, and their Supreme Court has recognized rights of the Amazonian region within Colombia. India, state courts have recognized the rights of the Ganges River. Bangladesh, Supreme Court recognized the rights of all rivers within that country. Peru, as I mentioned just a few days ago, recognized the rights of the first river there. So this work to recognize the rights of nature is happening literally at all levels of government. And it's growing. And from our experience, we work with people in different countries at local grassroots levels, at national levels, to move this forward. And it's just amazing because across cultures, across different ecosystems, across different continents, different countries, there's sort of this growing common understanding that we need to make a really fundamental shift in how we govern ourselves toward the natural world and how nature itself is treated by our laws and governance. And more, I see people coming to the rights of nature and saying, that's the fundamental shift that we need. And so just very quickly, right now, we've been working in places like Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, where they recently had what they call a constituent assembly, in which I think 100 people from across that country were brought together, were selected to focus on how do we deal with the biodiversity and climate change crisis here in Ireland. There you're seeing peatlands, marine areas, bird species, all sorts of decline of species, biodiversity, ecosystems. And as part of their recommendation to the National Parliament in Ireland, they recommended enshrining the rights of nature within that constitution, their constitution. So that's a process we've been involved with over the last 9 months or so. And so we're seeing if that can be moved forward toward possibly a national referendum. Aruba is currently considering a rights of nature amendment to their constitution. So you're seeing that move forward as well. And there are other efforts moving forward in different places. We're working in a number of different places. But to our minds, it's as much grief as I feel on a daily basis about the state of the environment. This is where I sort of set my hopes that people who are saying, we don't accept what's happening and we're going to actually move something forward. That's different, that changes how nature is treated and changes our relationship with the natural world. So I'll stop there. and see if we want to have any. Oh, you know what I forgot to mention? Spokane. I apologize. I was like, you got to remember Spokane. Spokane. I don't know how many of you remember. In 2009 and 2011, you had a chance to vote on the Community Bill of Rights. And that was an effort brought together by community neighborhood activists, people involved with their neighborhood groups, environmentalists, workers involved in labor unions, all gathered together over a process that we were involved in to say, we need more decision-making authority here in our communities and our neighborhood to protect the river. And so 2 different citizens initiatives were, I don't know if people are familiar with how they work, but essentially people came together through a collaborative process to draft a local law. And then you circulate it for petition, get a certain number of signatures from voters, and then it gets put, if you have enough signatures, gets put onto the ballot. And in 2009, this was first voted on, and then 2011, it was brought forward. So it didn't pass in 2009. In 2011, brought it forward again. It would recognize the rights of neighborhoods to be able to make certain development decisions. This was a time when a lot of folks, including in the South Hill, were very concerned about the development that took place, where Target is, and all of that, and the traffic impacts, and what would that mean on housing, and other real serious considerations. People who were specifically concerned about the Spokane River, and the initiative would recognize the rights of the Spokane River, as well as worker rights within the community that labor unions brought forward. So it was called a Community Bill of Rights, and had a number of rights to empower people, to recognize rights of neighborhoods, recognize rights of workers, recognize rights of the river. So it was brought forward in 2009, it didn't pass. 2011, brought forward again, lost by only really, I think about half a percentage point. And then brought forward again and was prevented from getting on the ballot by certain elected officials and developers who didn't like it and went to court, got it kicked off the ballot. But the great thing is that's still being discussed, even though I forgot about it. We've engaged with Spokane Riverkeeper, for instance, on this, and others, about maybe we can move something forward again to recognize the rights of the river or other rights of nature within the city of Spokane. So there, yay. So that's the local piece of this, and that's actually what brought me here in the first place, that effort. Which brought together some really good people who are really worried about what's going on in the city. So I'll stop there. We have about 25 minutes if folks want to ask questions, have conversation. Very happy to do that.
This is incredibly exciting, and I cannot believe I did not know about any of this. But I'm a member of an online community of people who I think would be very interested in this concept. Is there a way that I can link to this talk or something like it to share that information?
On our website, we have obviously background materials on what the rights of nature is. We maintain a rights of nature timeline. That's 12 pages at this point because there's been so much activity in so many places. FAQs, Rights of Nature Law Library, so you can see laws, court decisions that's happened in different places, and you can always reach us. So let me just put that up. The other thing I'll mention that we have is we've done a lot of online trainings, especially during the pandemic, for different groups, different communities that have been interested in what this kind of work looks like. We do trainings, we offer those as well, but we've also brought in different people from different countries like Philippines, from tribal nations, from Australia and elsewhere, Ecuador, about what's going on in their country, so you can hear from people in country about the different efforts advancing there. All of those are up on our website. So those can be really interesting if you want to delve deeper into like what is the white earth band of Chippewa doing, or what's going on in Philippines, where they have national legislation introduced to their Congress as well as local laws moving forward on rights of nature. So there's a lot of resources there. You're more than welcome to reach out to us as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Yes.
I thought through this a little bit, back when we were voting on it. Maybe.
Yeah.
But the part that I have not been able to envision that maybe you could elaborate on is, okay, we have these laws on the books. We also have corporate laws on the books. We have this permitting. Rather than this just becoming this huge web of lawsuits, how do you envision enforcement of these rights?
Yeah, so that's such a good question. And so there's enforcement, which generally means going to court to stop something bad from happening that would violate the rights of nature. There's also, the other sort of side to that coin is what we would think of as implementation. How do we actually make real the promise of these laws? So I'll talk about both of them. And the place where this is furthest along is in Ecuador, because they've had those constitutional provisions in place since 2008, so it's been quite a while. They've had a number of court cases being brought forward, generally by just individuals, indigenous communities, and others that go to court because they are literally trying to stop something bad from happening that they think is going to violate the rights of nature, so that violate the constitutional rights of the natural world there. One of the most famous cases, which you may have heard about from 2021, is for the Los Cedros Protected Forest. National government had issued permits to a mining corporation to conduct exploratory mining in a cloud forest, a very fragile ecosystem with at-risk species, and the community there brought a case that made its way up to the Constitutional Court. And what the Constitutional Court said was, yes, mining in this very fragile ecosystem, mining in the habitat of at-risk species is a violation of the rights of nature. And what they did, the way that they implemented that decision, is that they, number one, revoked the permit that the national government had given to the mining corporation, said it was in violation of the constitutional rights of the natural world. And number two, ruled that the exploratory mine infrastructure had to be removed. And so it was a very clear-cut case that very clearly violated the rights of this place, of these species, and had very clear implementation of that court decision. The mining industry is very much up in arms. They immediately went back to the Constitutional Court and asked them to further explain their decision, and the court was like, we mean what we say. So that's a really clear instance. What's also happened in Ecuador and another place that we continue to do work there. We have an attorney based in Quito who's not only doing things like filing amicus briefs around these different rights of nature court cases, but also we're working in the National Assembly, their parliament or their Congress. They already, of course, when the rights of nature came into being within Ecuador, they already had any number of rights of nature laws, environmental laws. And then when the rights of nature law came into place, the question was, what do we do? Does it stand next to them? Does it replace them? Does it get integrated into them? And that's really the question of implementation, and something that we're continuing to work on. Now, just to quickly understand sort of the dynamics within that country, at the time, President Correa, who was the president at the time that the Constitution was revised, he was no fan of the rights of nature, and administrations since then haven't been either. You have a National Assembly that isn't terribly fond of it either. And you have a mining industry, which is just, our attorney in Quito today sent me some essentially a Twitter canceling or assassination of some of the judges that have decided these rights of nature cases, trying to undermine them, to target them, to say that they are not good people. So there's all sorts of that kind of stuff happening. But what we've been working toward, and somewhat successful in that political environment, is starting to change how their existing environmental laws operate. So their existing environmental laws operate much like I described, authorizing certain industrial kinds of activities to take place, such as the mining in a cloud forest and the Los Cedros forest. So what we have done, they have what they call a public input process there. And we've engaged in that process whenever they've taken up environmental laws for review or reauthorization or whatever the process has been. Like their water laws, they have laws around Galapagos, they have all sorts of laws on the environment. And our input largely has been that the decision-making criteria that we're currently operating on does not contain the rights of nature, doesn't have the rights of nature as a consideration. That needs to be built in so that any decisions that are being made, so like when a mining corporation goes to the government and says, I want a permit to conduct mining here, there, or wherever, that in order to receive that permit, the mining corporation and the government have to guarantee that the rights of nature will not be violated by this mining project or by this pipeline project or whatever the industrial project is. Building that into the decision-making criteria. Because what we're thinking about, and sometimes it's easier to think about other rights because rights of nature are so new to us, which is when we think about, for instance, like our Bill of Rights here in the United States, they're often written, you can think of like in the negative, like the government shall make no law that will interfere with, like my right to practice my faith or my right to free speech. So the government has had to change how it operates under those bills of rights, under the different amendments to the Bill of Rights, so that they're not interfering with my right to free speech, my right to due process, my right to be free from search and seizure, unwarranted search and seizure. And so you think about it, the government has to work around those so they're not violating my rights. They're not always so great at that, nonetheless. They have to figure out how their activities, their decision-making, their governing is not interfering with those rights. That's where the rights of nature is in Ecuador right now. It's a constitutional right. So the government has to figure out how do we operate around this, not only so we don't interfere with it, but that we're actually guaranteeing these rights. They're not there yet. I don't mean to pretend they are. But the courts have been the ones that really have been a source of just tremendous advancement of the rights of nature within Ecuador because there's just been so much more activity there. Their parliament or their national assembly has been slow to do that. We're continuing to push on it. And so to answer, a long way of answering your question, which is enforcement is sort of the straightest line arrow to stop something bad from happening that would violate those rights. But the long term, to our mind, is you really have to change your environmental laws, how they're operating now, so that they are understanding, okay, these rights exist, we operate around that so that we can't interfere with it, we can't damage it. We're actually trying to uphold it and guarantee it. And that's a process that's still ongoing. One other place I'll mention, which is in Minnesota, the White Earth Band of Chippewa, we worked with them, I think it was 2018, that they adopted their rights of monomen, or wild rice. You may be familiar, in Minnesota, you have the Enbridge pipelines that are going through, like Line 3, Line 5. These pipelines, the state of Minnesota is giving these pipelines just tremendous amounts, the use of tremendous amounts of fresh water as part of the construction of these pipelines. Wild rice grows in freshwater habitat. Minnesota's in a tremendous drought right now. You have this development occurring, you have pipelines, et cetera, all this dewatering. And so the habitat, the species, is increasingly at risk. And so the White Earth determined they needed to protect the wild rice. They needed to recognize that it has legal rights that they can enforce. And so they, and we assisted, brought a case into their tribal court to try to protect these rights. And the state of Minnesota got it kicked out. But the idea is they then went further and put in place further water protection laws to uphold these rights. Understanding it's not, I hate to say one and done, but it's not one and done. It's a process. And I think when we look at the history of other movements in this country, when others have fought for their legal rights, it's a process. All the women in the room are going, yeah, that's a damn process. It's not one thing. It's not one law. It's a constant effort to push further to fully realize those rights, whether it be through government decision-making, whether it be through courts, whatever it may be. So in Ecuador and elsewhere, it's a process. We have seen some really good decisions come out of places like Panama now, upholding the legal rights of nature. Is a fairly new law there, and some other places. So it's moving forward. It's not as fast as we would like, of course, but it's actually a lot faster than we ever expected.
Would you be willing to talk a little bit about this extremely abstract concept of nature? Because I think it raises questions about the scope to which the evolution of this movement might go. People have said, for example, that there's no real reason for domesticated cattle to exist anymore. And there's also a scope question about if everything in nature has rights, how do the human rights dovetail with the the iguana's rights, that sort of thing. So just maybe the scope and maybe a little concretizing of that abstraction.
Yeah, it's a constant question, as you can imagine. In Ecuador, the Constitution recognizes the rights of nature, what they call Pachamama, so all of nature. Other places, it's a specific ecosystem, like a river, or a specific species, like wild rice. And so when we think about this, very often, number one, these laws define, like if it's a river ecosystem forever, you can think, oh, is that just the water in the riverbed? Is it something broader? These laws generally define what that means. What do we mean by a river? Often it can be the whole watershed, it can be the catchment area, it can be a particular section, depending on the jurisdiction. So the laws are getting more precise about those definitions, number one. Number two, when we think about the rights of nature, we're thinking about, we're often asked, like, does that mean I can't mow my lawn, for instance? Which, think about it. Maybe you shouldn't, number one. But number two. Number two is what we're really talking about is natural systems and trying to keep healthy natural systems. So, for instance, another example from Ecuador was there was the Estrelito monkey case. Has anyone heard of this case? So for reasons I can't explain to you, a wild monkey was somehow captured, and a woman raised the monkey in her home for however many years. And it became this huge case, and a really sad case. But the particulars of the case aren't my concern at the moment. What the court did, though, was this is a wild animal being taken out of the wild. And so the court was sort of like, well, what do we do when we're thinking about species that are at risk? What does that mean? And what the court has in Ecuador has said is things like that when we're thinking about a natural system, that could be an ecosystem, it could be a species. So, if I decide to mow my lawn, am I destroying grasslands? Grassland ecosystem? No, I'm not. We had a guy in New Hampshire once say, well, does this mean I can't shoot squirrels in my yard anymore? And no, that's not going to violate the rights of nature. You're not harming the species of squirrel. But when you are dealing with an at-risk species, every member of that population of that species is important to the health of the whole. And that's what the court said, essentially, is that if you harm, whatever that might mean, kill a member of an at-risk species, you're putting that whole species at risk. So that would be a violation of the rights of nature. But killing one squirrel, when we have so many squirrels, that would not be a violation because you're not putting it at risk to even exist. So there's no perfect answer to your question. And I think this work is continuing to evolve. But the precision of these laws are getting more defined in terms of geography and defining what an ecosystem, whatever the ecosystem is, looks like, what the species is, where it is, as well as, and I should just add, that these laws also include, importantly, partly back to your question, that And this is different from conventional modern day environmental laws, which it's very, very difficult to enforce those laws if you're just a human being existing in the world. It's really hard to go to court have the court determine that, yeah, you have a right to be there to try to enforce this environmental laws. One of the things that we were very focused on early and continue to be with the rights of nature laws is not only recognizing that nature possesses certain legal rights and determining what those rights are, but also ensuring that there are provisions to allow us to be able to enforce these rights. Right now, under modern day conventional environmental laws, it's really difficult to do that. You have to be able to have standing to be able to go into court to try to enforce an environmental law. You have to show that you've been harmed somehow by the violation of this law, whatever that might look like. Maybe your tap water is polluted now, for instance, which is something that's happened in many places. But you can't just sort of look at a river that's being polluted that doesn't have a direct impact on you and try to go to court to enforce the rights of the river. Number one, there are no rights to enforce. And number two, the court's not going to recognize that you've experienced some kind of harm and therefore have legal standing to be there. What the rights of nature laws do, and something that we felt was critically and continues to be critically important, is it empowers people within a jurisdiction where that law exists to be able to go into court not on their own behalf, but on behalf of the river, in the name of the river or the other ecosystem or species, whatever it might be. So they're literally standing in the shoes of the river to recognize the rights of the river. And we see this parallel in other laws, and one of the clearest instances in what we've studied, particularly are child negligence laws, in which children who, they can't go into court on their own. They need to have someone stand in their shoes. And that someone is often called, designated as a guardian ad litem, a guardian for the child. That's part of what's happening with the rights of nature, is recognizing of guardians, legal guardians, but it could also just be anyone in a place where that law is able to go into court to enforce those rights, whether or not they've experienced harm because of harm to the river, but because the river itself is experiencing harm and its rights are being violated. So that's one of the really important pieces I should have mentioned earlier, which is that's one of the main things that we learned from modern day conventional environmental laws is they do such a purposefully terrible job of giving us the power to try to work within those laws, to use those laws, to protect nature within those laws. The rights of nature laws are really defined and drafted very differently for the very purpose of ensuring that when our governments fail to do the job that we ask them to do, whether for political reasons or other, that we can do it, and it empowers people, I think, to be able to do that. And in Ecuador, it hasn't been the government that's enforced the rights of nature, it's been the people who've taken the hard work of building court cases to go into court to do it.
Is there anything on the books about the rights of the ocean? Because I would think that would just back up to every stream, every ecosystem streaming in, that if you got that down, everything else would just, oh, sorry, it's going to hurt the ocean.
Everything hurts the ocean.
Right?
Yeah, it's all downstream.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah, no, there has been declarations on rights of the oceans that have been drafted. That hasn't become law anywhere. There have been focus on trying to protect the rights of marine protected areas. So those are efforts that are going forward as well. But they haven't been recognized yet. By the way, did anyone see 60 Minutes this week? No. It wasn't about rights of nature, but I thought it was just really interesting how they framed the story about the law of the sea, if you're familiar with that, which their focus was on underwater sea mining to get at rare earth minerals, and that the United States is basically the lone holdout on signing on to this treaty, and it's a handful of senators who've been holding this up in the United States forever. But what was so interesting about it was that the whole segment was focused on the problem that the United States is undermining ourselves by not signing on to this treaty, because it means that we are not given the ability to mine under the ocean, outside of our legal territory waters. And they showed this mining and whatever, but they never framed the problem as maybe we shouldn't be doing this at all. Maybe this is going to damage in ways that we can't possibly mitigate the oceans. It was all about that we're going to lose out on this incredibly economic important opportunity. And it just, it's just a reminder of, number one, how important the oceans are, which you bring up rightly, but also just how we're still just so, in my opinion, we don't have a clue about what's going on this planet largely. We see it in our media, we see it in our laws, we see it, I don't think I've heard the environment mentioned apart from a few climate things around Biden in the presidential race. I just think that it's sort of like we're all standing around like this, and I don't mean we, the people in this room, but I mean generally speaking, governments, the big media corporations, all of them, I think that they are just so willfully blind to what's going on. And the oceans in particular, with the heat that the report they just released about how hot the oceans are right now, that the main stream, what do we call it, the Gulf Stream in the Atlantic is going to dissipate and, force massive temperature swings in the northern hemisphere. I just think that we are so somehow not paying attention to the elephant in the room. It's just striking to me. I don't know if others feel differently.
So, and one more comment or question. So on the website, so I always think it starts in the home, right? So, go to the grocery store, you buy your laundry detergent in a big plastic bottle with all the plastics in the ocean.
Yeah.
You carry all your stuff out to the car in a plastic bag,
Right.
But are there things listed there that we can do that, that maybe we haven't thought of? I'm appreciating dandelions in the yard instead of the perfect green grass.
Right.
Changing the whole mindset.
Yeah.
What's
We don't
there.
actually focus on the things. When
No.
when people say, what can we do? We do have things on the website about this, is start organizing in your own community.
Yeah, exactly.
That's where we focus.
Yeah, okay.
Are you doing anything at the state level?
Not in the state of Washington. Right now, our main state work has been in North Carolina, where we've worked with the Indigenous Caucus of the Democratic Party there to draft a state legislation that was introduced to recognize rights of the Haw River. I don't know if you're familiar with that river, and they're focusing on some other rivers there in that area as well. And it's the first legislation introduced in any state that would recognize the rights of a particular ecosystem. So we're happy. I don't know how far that's going to move, but it's good to see it going. And then there have been some state Democratic parties that have recognized the rights of nature within their policy platforms. So far, so that's where we've been.
I just think you might have better luck at the state level than our local.
Maybe. Yeah, it depends. I mean, this is tough stuff to move forward. And there are strong interests, which is one of the reasons why, I've talked about past movements in the States. I mean, we're such a big country that, in Ecuador, it started at the national level, which we, at the time, didn't think was even possible to make national level change, but there you go. In the States, we think this is going to follow the pattern of other, like, mass movements, really growing from the grassroots, like the civil rights movement, abolitionist movements, and others, and driving up to the state level, and ultimately, hopefully, federal level change.
Does that mean you have a political wing to your organization?
We do have we're a 501c3 nonprofit. We also have a C4, which is political, but we mainly assist communities, other organizations, and in places like I mentioned in Ireland, that are building political campaigns to help them on their outreach and engagement and education stuff. We're not the political front leaders in those places. It's the people on the ground who really need to be, and we see ourselves as helping to catalyze those efforts. Feel free to reach out, and I really appreciate people coming out. It's really nice to see people.
Thank you.
Hey, my name is Mason and I'm here at the Liberty Park Library. We hope you come by and visit us sometime and see all that we have going on. You're watching City Cable 5.